Now let's talk about phosphorus. The range for phosphorus is 2.7 to 4.5. Obviously, anything above 4.5 is going to be hyperphosphatemia. Anything below 2.7 is going to be hypophosphatemia. Some high points here about phosphorus. Phosphorus is the primary ion of the intracellular fluid. And as we talk about the concepts mentioned next, this will come back and be reinforced by something you kind of already know. You will remember that the ion that's essential for all cells, you may not remember this immediately off the top of your head, but for all cellular energy exchanges, phosphorus is the key. I just want to refresh your memory. What is ATP? ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So that triphosphate and the production of energy is the result of oxidative phosphorylation. You probably thought you were never going to hear those words again after you did your physiology, or if it was maybe microbiology where you may have discussed what's going on inside the cell. I don't know. But this exchange of a phosphate from ATP to ADP, that cleavage, that oxidative phosphorylation, that is what produces energy in the mitochondria, in the cell. And that, go back to Krebs cycle electron transport chain. We're talking at very, very molecular level in the production of energy here is the role of this ion, phosphate. So it has also wide repercussions. It also helps oxygen release from hemoglobin. So the phosphorylation inside of hemoglobin facilitates oxygen being released out to the tissues so that carbon dioxide can come onto hemoglobin. We can talk about it again here in just a second, but that carbon dioxide needs to be able to bind, and the affinity of hemoglobin for either CO2 or O2 is affected by phosphate. That said, it's also essential for central nervous system functioning. All of these processes, you listening to this lecture, getting ready to answer these questions from that I draw off these slides, all of those are dependent on phosphate processing in the brain and other tissues. It also helps maintain acid-base balance. We're going to paint this picture more clearly after we've had acid-base, which will be the beginning of the third unit. And then particularly when we talk about DKA, we'll pull this all together with phosphate and its contributions, mainly because of what it binds and that impact it has on electrolytes, that impact the electrolytes that then impact acid-base balance. So it plays a key role there. It is essential, phosphorus is essential for carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism. And as you can see, those are all of our dietary requirements. Our bodily source of energy comes from either carbohydrates, fats, or proteins, and that metabolism is dependent upon phosphorus. It is also essential in the synthesis of both DNA and RNA, not just its synthesis, but also its expression, because this oxidative phosphorylation, again, plays a role in the way DNA, the process of DNA comes together, the process of the way DNA, RNA all function together, and then the way those genes within the DNA get expressed and show up in response to different bodily needs or evolutionary changes. Phosphorus is also essential for the energy for white blood cells to perform the role of phagocytosis. So our natural, our inbred, genetic, essential, God-given, whatever you like to think of, defense mechanism against infection and bodily assault is phagocytosis in white blood cells, and we need phosphorus for that. Also plays a role in teeth and bone formation, as it relates to calcium. Remember, one of the first lectures we had, I talked about the phospholipid bilayer. It is also an essential component in the very composition of the cells of the body. There is the phosphorus component and the lipid component. The phosphorus component were those little beads that are the hydrophilic component, and the lipid portion of that membrane were the extensions that hung down from what looked like that little ball. So this phospholipid bilayer is constructed 50% of phosphorus. So it's essential to our cell wall structure. Most phosphorus is going to be absorbed in the small intestine, and then 90% of it's going to be excreted in the urine. So this is consistent with what I've said before: absorbed in the gut, excreted in the urine. Absorbed in the gut, excreted in the urine. So back to some concepts we talked about earlier with calcium. Phosphorus is affected by parathyroid hormone. So when parathyroid hormone is signaled by calcium, we have an increase of release of calcium from the bone, increase in absorption from the tissues, and decreased reabsorption of renal tubules. In other words, as I mentioned earlier, the body holds on to calcium. As the body holds on to calcium, phosphorus levels go down. One, they're going to be bound to some calcium, but then also that process of regulation changes the way the body responds to phosphorus. It's going to excrete more out of the kidneys in response to the increase in calcium. And that's the next point there. In this response, the response from this parathyroid hormone results in the excretion of phosphorus in the urine. Insulin also contributes here because insulin transports phosphorus into the cell in addition to transporting glucose. So this ion moving into the cell, this is going to be one of the ways in which it plays a role in the acid-base balance. And again, we'll talk about that more later. We have to give you some information about acid-base regulation before we can get too deep in the regulatory process of that and phosphorus's role there. So hypophosphatemia, or low phosphorus less than 2.7 milligrams per deciliter, is generally caused by one of these three major causes, and that is a shift from extracellular fluid into the intracellular fluid. So different conditions can cause phosphorus to shift from being extracellular or in the bloodstream where we can measure it to moving into the cell. Like we just mentioned, DKA, we were talking about that in the previous slide, but also anxiety, alcohol withdrawal, the alcohol withdrawal process, sepsis, hyperventilation. Those conditions can cause these shifts. Also, very high sugars, like I just mentioned with DKA. So DKA, but also hyperglycemic hyperosmolar syndrome can also produce what looks like a ketoacidosis, high sugars, and can also contribute to a shift inside the cell. Another thing that can cause hypophosphatemia, which is probably more common, is intestinal issues with intestinal absorption. So if there are conditions that cause the gut to move more quickly, for example, laxatives, diarrhea, Crohn's disease, those kind of conditions, or think about another thing that we've trained on this semester is NG tube placement. So in both of those conditions, you're removing phosphorus in whatever state it's moving into the gut. You're removing it, or it's moving through so quickly it doesn't have a chance to absorb. So diarrhea moves everything through the stool quickly. Laxatives do the same thing. So those are places in which the gut doesn't have enough time to absorb. Things like starvation, eating disorders, alcoholism, those conditions, the nutrients aren't even provided. So the patient doesn't have an adequate source of phosphorus coming in through their diet in order to produce or maintain a phosphorus level. Phosphate binders also can contribute to hypophosphatemia if they're not taken appropriately. So phosphate binders are actually medications that are administered and bind phosphorus in the gut and prevent it from being absorbed. So it's different from the other two. The patient has actually consumed the phosphorus. They're taking phosphate binders, perhaps because their nephrologist wants them to do this because of kidney issues, and that phosphorus that they've ingested is now getting bound and moved out of the gut. If the dosage is too high, it could eliminate too much phosphate. Also, medications like Carafate or Sucralfate prevent absorption of nutrients in the stomach and small intestine. That's the way they're designed to treat ulcers. They coat the stomach, and those can impair phosphorus binding and may prevent an adequate supply of phosphorus. Also, anything that can increase renal excretion. So think about diuretics and other conditions that cause a high degree of urine output. So some of the effects of hypophosphatemia. Musculoskeletal issues are one of the early symptoms that show up, particularly skeletal muscles and respiratory muscles. So we may see weakness here, or balance issues, or gait disturbances. Profound hypophosphatemia can cause a weakness or even paresthesia of the respiratory muscles, the diaphragm, make the diaphragm really weak, which can impair cough reflex and impair even their capacity to breathe. So respiratory failure is a potential side effect of hypophosphatemia should it become severe enough. So these are the kind of things you tune into, because remember, those muscle cells need ATP in order to contract, but we still need our respiratory muscles. Even if we've got other problems going on, we need our respiratory muscles to be nice and strong so that we can breathe well. Neurological changes such as confusion, memory loss, irritability, paresthesia, these are all potential neurological changes as a result of hypophosphatemia. Remember, as I mentioned, low phosphorus means that these cells in the brain do not have the energy they need to produce their normal biologic functions. Cardiovascular issues, if you've got weak muscle, and not because the muscle's been injured, but because the muscle doesn't have fuel, it doesn't have ATP, then that can decrease cardiac output, that can impair vascular tone, which a decreased vascular tone is going to contribute to hypotension, and those things together can contribute to what is called a cardiomyopathy. Generally, a cardiomyopathy is going to evolve over time. It's not going to happen just as soon as your phosphorus levels drop. But remember, as with most electrolytes, patients may not have symptoms when the electrolytes are mildly low. Symptoms usually start to present when the electrolytes are moderately or severely out of balance. That said, we have to tune into these things and pay attention to changes in blood pressure, to changes in cardiac function. this is the portion. The next portion here is what I mentioned earlier, and I don't expect you to memorize this. I just want you to grasp a little, just grasp the essence of this. So hemoglobin, when 2,3-diphosphoglycerate is decreased, that increases the affinity for oxygen. In other words, when we have this diphosphoglycerate, oxygen is going to stay bound to hemoglobin. Another way to say that is it won't let go, or it won't move out into the tissues that it needs, that's needed. So what we want is we want adequate phosphorus levels so that when this oxygen binds to hemoglobin, when we take a nice breath, and then it moves through the vasculature, out of the heart, into the bloodstream, and moves out to the tissues, that there's plenty of appropriate triphosphoglycerate so that oxygen will leave that hemoglobin and move out into the bloodstream, or into the tissues where the tissues can get oxygenated. If phosphorus is low, then that oxygen is going to stay on the hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is going to stay out in the tissues, and oxygen is just going to keep circulating. Similarly, the WBCs need adenosine triphosphate in order to fight infection, like I mentioned earlier with phagocytosis. With severe hypophosphatemia, you may see conditions such as rhabdomyolysis. This is a condition where the degree of illness, strain on the body is severe enough that the body feels or senses the need to begin to break down muscle for energy. We'll talk about diabetes, particularly DKA, when the body goes to break down fats for metabolism and what that does. This case, we're talking about the body breaking down muscle for energy. And in that situation, you have a profound increase in creatinine kinase. So there's a lot of junk in the bloodstream for the kidneys to filter that can then clog the kidneys or back up the kidneys and cause renal failure. So how do we manage hypophosphatemia? As I've said, with almost every electrolyte so far in every condition, treat the cause, manage the symptoms. So we want to be very tuned into the symptoms as they give us warning and indication of the direction the patient's going. We want to do that, but we also have to treat the cause. If we're not addressing the cause, then let's look at some of these causes here. So if we're not addressing nutrition for intestinal absorption, we can supplement all we want, but if we're not going to get there if we're not getting adequate nutrition. If it's a fluid shift issue and we're not addressing sepsis or managing alcohol withdrawal or DKA, we're never going to fix the problem. So we have to treat the cause and then manage the symptoms. We're going to we'll start with dietary replacement. That's the easiest solution. That may not be enough. We may have to provide oral supplementation. So in that case, oral supplements would look like Nutrifos. That is the easiest over-the-counter tablets that patients can either swallow or dissolve in water. Patients may require IV replacement if the hypophosphatemia is severe enough. It could be sodium or potassium phosphate, or even calcium phosphate. It depends on if there is another electrolyte deficiency. So, for example, if a patient has a low potassium and they have a low phosphate, then it would be reasonable to give them potassium phosphate. You could treat both the hypocalcemia and the hypophosphatemia simultaneously. As I've mentioned before, any electrolytes that we give, we're going to give slowly and monitor the site because they can be, electrolytes can be vesicants in the bloodstream, particularly with peripheral IVs. As with all other electrolytes that we've mentioned, we're going to monitor EKG. we're going to monitor vital signs and respiratory pattern and effect. We're not looking in this case for bronchospasm, we're looking for respiratory depression. We'll be very tuned into that. Lung sounds are going to help with that because you put your stethoscope on someone and they're not moving much air and they don't have another reason such as asthma or something like that, then that's an indication that we've got a poor respiratory effort and we want to tune in. And fever is going to be another thing we watch here, since fever can be an indication that perhaps the white blood cells are not effective in fighting infection. Labs we're going to monitor, as we mentioned with the others, BU and creatinine we're going to monitor because of kidney function as always. Remember, 90% of this is excreted in the urine. So we want to make sure kidney function's okay. Calcium levels, because of its inverse relationship to phosphorus, we need to keep a check on calcium. Also, because calcium can have an impact on digoxin. If we have low phosphorus, we're most likely going to have high calcium, and calcium can precipitate dig toxicity. So we want to be tuned into that. Then also albumin, because remember, calcium binds albumin, so we need to be tuned in to what is our albumin level in the context of this hypophosphatemia. Also, we're going to add here to this electrolyte a CBC, particularly to monitor WBCs. We want to know if we have adequate white blood cells. Do we have adequate and they're not working, or do we have inadequate and we've got another problem? And as with almost all the other electrolytes, maintaining a diligent attention to orientation and mentation. Those subtle mentation changes can be some of the earliest warning signs that we have an issue. Next, we will move our attention to hyperphosphatemia.